The building was already breathing wrong when I kicked the door open. Not smoke. Not yet. Something chemical, low and colorless, the kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself until it's already inside you. I felt it in the back of my throat before I saw anything. A metallic sweetness, faintly acetone, faintly wrong. My hand went to my radio before my brain caught up. Second floor, southeast corner, Pioneer Square warehouse. Possible active lab. Requesting hazmat and forensic support. What I didn't say on the radio, I was already inside. What I also didn't say, the forensic specialist I'd specifically requested was the one person in the Seattle PD support network I had spent the last 7 months carefully, professionally, determinedly not thinking about. Emre Aslan. 31. The kind of calm that doesn't perform itself, the kind that's just there, like load-bearing architecture. He'd been brought in from the county lab 8 months ago as a consulting specialist for chemical trace analysis, and the first time I'd watched him work a scene, gloved hands moving like a surgeon's, head tilted with that particular quality of attention that meant he'd already seen 3 things I hadn't, I'd made a private, silent decision. Not this one. Not at work. Not ever. 7 months of that decision. 7 months of professional distance, clean handoffs, eye contact that I measured to exactly the correct duration. And then dispatch had said chemical exposure risk, and I'd asked for Emre by name before I finished the sentence. I was halfway up the interior stairwell when I heard the door below me open, not the main entrance, the side entrance, the one marked maintenance, SAFE EGRESS in faded yellow stenciling. The one I'd propped myself, Voss. His voice, lower than the chemical smell, more grounding. Stairwell, I called back, keeping my own voice level. Northeast corner. Come up slow. There's something in the air. 30 seconds later, he was beside me on the landing. He had his field kit over one shoulder and a portable air quality monitor already running in his left hand. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the monitor. Hydrogen cyanide precursor, he said quietly. Low concentration? We have maybe 15 minutes before it becomes a problem without masks. Masks are in the kit? 2 of them. He glanced up then, and there it was, that thing I spent 7 months managing. The quality of attention he gave me was the same quality he gave evidence. Complete, unhurried, like he wasn't deciding what to see. Good, I said, and looked away first. If this is your first time here, stay with me and subscribe. There's a new story every single day. The lab was on the 2nd floor, through a fire door that had been propped open with a fire extinguisher. Someone had left in a hurry, or someone had wanted airflow, or both. The room beyond was what Hazmat would later describe as a mid-production methamphetamine synthesis operation with secondary fentanyl analog processing, which is a very clean sentence for what was actually a room full of heat-warped plastic tubing, chemical smell so thick it had texture, and a workbench that had partially collapsed after whatever small detonation had brought the initial call in. What it was not. Empty? There. Emre said it before I saw it. A figure slumped against the far wall, half under the collapsed bench. Male, 40s, unconscious or close to it. Not a suspect. The positioning was wrong. The clothes were wrong. Worker. Maybe a cook who'd been caught in the initial pressure event. I crossed the room. Emre was already moving parallel, kit open, pulling the half masks out with practiced efficiency. Put this on before you get any closer, he said, and held one out without looking, his eyes on the unconscious man, calculating. I took the mask. Our fingers overlapped on the strap for 1 second. He didn't pull his hand back immediately. Are you still with me? Good, because this is where it starts to cost something. The man's name, we'd learn later, was Dennis Okafor. He'd been employed by the operation as a cleaner. Someone paid to sanitize the lab between production cycles. Someone kept deliberately ignorant of the full chemistry so he couldn't testify to it. He'd been in the building when the pressure vessel failed. He'd been in the building for at least 4 hours. His breathing was shallow. His lips were faintly blue. Cyanide exposure, I asked. Emre crouched beside me, pressed 2 fingers to Dennis's wrist, looked at his eyes. Possibly. More likely fentanyl analog. The lab was processing. His pupils are... He paused. Cillian, he needs naloxone and he needs it before Hazmat gets here. I have it. I did. Standard kit. Every officer on chemical exposure calls carried it now. I already had it out. Left deltoid, Emre said. I'll stabilize his arm. What happened next was the kind of thing that looks simple from the outside and isn't. Emre held the man's arm with both hands, firm and steady, and I administered the injection, and for the 30 seconds it took, we were close enough that I could hear Emre breathe through his mask. Close enough that when he shifted his weight to better support Dennis's arm, his shoulder pressed against mine and stayed there. Not because there wasn't room, but because the floor was uneven and the angle required it, and neither of us adjusted. Dennis's color began to improve within 90 seconds. Okay, I said. Okay, Emre agreed. We stayed where we were for a moment longer than we needed to. The next 40 minutes were operational. Hazmat arrived. Paramedics took Dennis. 2 detectives from narcotics came in full PPE and started photographing the lab. Emre worked the room with the systematic precision I'd watched him apply to 100 scenes, swabbing surfaces, bagging samples, dictating quiet observations into his recorder with that particular economy of language that meant he was in the part of his brain that didn't waste anything. I watched him work. I was supposed to be coordinating with narcotics, but I kept finding reasons to stay in the room. He knew. I could tell he knew, not because he acknowledged it, but because he started narrating slightly louder, the way you do when you're aware of an audience. Small thing. Observable only if you were paying the kind of attention I had spent 7 months pretending not to pay. Around the 40-minute mark, one of the hazmat techs called from the stairwell. There was a secondary storage room, accessed through the fire door we'd come in through, with possible additional chemical inventory. I went to check. Standard procedure, what was not standard. Emre followed me, not because it was his call, not because narcotics needed him. He just came. Fell in beside me without explanation, kit over his shoulder, monitor still running. I didn't ask why. The storage room was behind a door marked electrical, which was, we would note in our reports, a deliberate misdirection. What was actually behind it was a climate-controlled space, possibly originally a server room, now holding approximately 60 liters of precursor chemicals in sealed containers, stacked with surprising care. Methodical, Emre said quietly, scanning the shelves. This wasn't improvised. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. 3-4 people minimum to run this volume, I said. More. He moved along the shelving, reading labels. The synthesis pathway they were using requires a dedicated titration step that one person can't manage alone. You need someone on temperature, someone on pH, someone watching the catalyst addition. This is, he paused, tilting one container slightly to read the bottom label. This is graduate-level chemistry, Cillian. He used my first name. He'd used it before, professionally, in rooms full of people. This was a room with 2 people in it. I kept my eyes on the door. How do you know all of this? I asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment. I heard him set the container back. I did my master's thesis on clandestine synthesis identification, he said. University of Washington, 2018. My advisor was a former DEA chemist. A pause. I spent a lot of time learning how things are made in order to know how they fall apart. I turned to look at him then. He was already looking at me. Not the shelves, not the monitor. Me, that's a very specific skill to have, I said. It brought me here, he said simply. The room was small. The air monitor beeped softly, levels acceptable. The precursor storage was sealed. The light was a single hanging fluorescent, the kind that makes everyone look slightly underwater. He looked, I thought, like something I wasn't supposed to want this much. We should document the inventory. I said, we should. He agreed. Neither of us moved for one more second. Then he pulled out his tablet and started photographing, and I pulled out my notebook, and we worked the room. In the careful proximity of 2 people who have decided, silently and without negotiation, to be honest about something without saying it out loud. This is the part I go back to. Not the action, not the naloxone, not the chemical exposure, not the evidence that would eventually unravel a 6-county distribution network. This part. The storage room, the fluorescent light. The 2 of us moving around each other in a space that required coordination, finding a rhythm that felt like it had existed before either of us named it. At one point, I needed to photograph a high shelf, and he moved behind me without being asked, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air, and steadied the ladder I was standing on. Not because it was unsteady, but because the floor was slightly uneven and he'd noticed. His hands were on the sides of the ladder, and I was aware of them the entire time I was on the top step. "Got it," I said. "Take your time," he said. I came down the ladder, one rung too slowly. When my feet hit the floor, he was still holding the ladder's sides, and I turned and we were close, facing each other. His hands released the ladder and dropped to his sides, and I thought, very clearly, if I don't say something right now, I will be thinking about this specific moment for years. Emre. "I know," he said. "Just that. I know." "Is this?" I started. "Yes," he said, not guessing at what the question was, just answering it. I raised my hand and adjusted the collar of his jacket. His PPE layer had ridden up unevenly on one side, which was true, which was a real thing that needed doing. My fingers moved the fabric, smoothed it flat against his shoulder, and then rested there one moment longer than the task required. His hand came up and covered mine, palm to palm, his fingers finding the spaces between mine with a patience that felt like it had been waiting. We stood like that in the electrical storage room of a clandestine drug laboratory in Seattle's Pioneer Square, our hands laced together, the air monitor reading acceptable, the fluorescent light making everything look underwater. "You okay?" I asked. "I keep being," he said. "Me too." We didn't talk about it on the way back through the main lab. We didn't talk about it while we gave our preliminary statements to narcotics, or while Hazmat did their final sweep, or while we signed the evidence chain of custody forms in the hallway. What we did? He handed me forms, and I took them from the side where our fingers would meet. I held doors, and he walked through them close enough that we were briefly in the same threshold. When a narcotics detective asked us a question at the same time, we answered in sequence without stepping on each other, and the detective, a woman named Pham, who had worked with me for 3 years, looked between us with an expression I cataloged and decided to address, never. The building was cleared by 11 p.m. We stood on the sidewalk outside, the cold Seattle air coming off the Sound 2 blocks west. The warehouse behind us now lit with forensic lights that made it glow faintly through the boarded windows. Emre had his field kit at his feet. I had my jacket open because I'd overheated inside and hadn't remembered to close it. "I'll have the preliminary chemical analysis to you by Thursday," he said. "I know you will," I said. A pause. "I meant what I said," he said. "In there." "I know that too." The thing about Emre, the thing I had been carefully not examining for 7 months, was that his stillness wasn't absence. It was the opposite. It was a kind of presence so complete that it made everything around him quieter. Standing next to him on that sidewalk, the city doing its city things, a siren 3 blocks north, a light rail announcement, the distant specific smell of the waterfront, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Located. Like being somewhere specific instead of just being somewhere. "There's a place on First Avenue," I said. "Coffee. They're open late." He looked at me. In the streetlight, his face was, I don't have a better word than open. Not unguarded, open, like a door that's been unlocked and now the handle is just waiting. "Not tonight," he said. My chest did something complicated. Because tonight was significant," he said, "and I don't want to put something small on top of something significant." He picked up his field kit. "Thursday, when I bring you the analysis. Coffee then." I looked at him. "Thursday?" I said. "Thursday," he confirmed. He started walking toward his car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched him go and felt, not disappointed, not dismissed, held, like the answer was being kept somewhere safe until we were ready for it. I went back to the precinct and wrote my report, and it took 2 hours, and I did not think about Emre Aslan, except that I thought about nothing else. The report was good anyway. It's possible to write a thorough incident report while a specific person's hands are occupying the background of your entire brain. I can confirm this professionally. At 1:47 a.m., my phone lit up, the SAFE egress door. Did you notice it? I stared at the message for a moment. Notice what? I typed back. The paint on the frame. Someone had repainted it recently, within the last 2 weeks. But the stenciling was old. The operation was using that door as their primary exit because it reads as emergency infrastructure. People don't question SAFE egress. I thought about this. So it was camouflage. I typed. It was a door that said SAFE and meant something else. A pause, the typing indicator appearing and disappearing twice. I keep thinking about doors that say one thing and mean another. I sat with that for a long moment. I think the door we found was actually safe, I typed back. I think we read it correctly. The reply took longer this time, yes. I think we did. I put my phone down. Picked it up again. Thursday, I typed. Thursday, he confirmed. Sleep, Cillian. You too, Emre. The CCTV footage from the warehouse exterior, pulled during evidence review, timestamp 2247, shows two figures on the sidewalk outside the Pioneer Square warehouse, one tall, jacket open despite the cold. One slightly shorter, field kit at his feet. They are standing closer than the conversation requires. The taller one says something. The shorter one is still for a moment, then picks up his kit and walks. The taller one doesn't move for a while. It's not much to look at. Grainy, overexposed at the streetlight, the audio entirely absent. But if you watch the way the taller figure stands on that sidewalk after the other has gone, not hunched, not sad, just still, the way a person is still when something has settled into them and they're letting it settle, it looks like what it is. Two men who found something real in a chemical hazard warehouse on a Tuesday night and had the good sense to keep it safe until they were ready to open it. Thursday was 4 days away. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like something to look forward to.